The Merciless is one of the Dark Knights in the DC universe, and he also happens to be a combat cycle boss in DC Dark Legion. Today, we're going to be taking a look at his kit. We're going to talk about a few teams that can be used against him effectively, and then we'll look at a couple of boss fights. So Merciless has a couple of abilities. He has Rallying Cry, and he has Fires of Hades. The way this fight works is Merciless kind of sits in the background, and he's going to be summoning a bunch of minions in front of him who you're going to have to fight. While you're fighting those minions, which are summoned through Rallying Cry, you're also going to have to deal with a fairly substantial AoE. It's going to be a line AoE rather than a circular AoE that we've seen with some of the other characters like Devastator, but it's going to do significant damage to a few of your characters, and you'll have to heal up from that. Now, in general, I don't think this is a difficult fight, but you are going to want to have a decent amount of AoE damage, and you'll want some pretty tanky characters to put up front so that they can take a brunt of the damage from all of the minions that are going to be summoned. Now let's take a look at some of the characters that I think will be helpful for certain levels of spend. First, I'll mention that as with some of the other guys that you may have seen already, I've included a couple of characters that are sort of support in nature that I think are great at 0 stars. They have a decent amount of viability to help push the damage of the rest of your team. I actually think that Merciless is a very free-to-play accessible boss. That's because there are a couple of legendaries that do decent AoE damage in Black Adam and Red Hood. Obviously, Red Hood has a survivability issue, and you will most likely lose him towards the end of the fight unless you're able to keep up with your healing. Obviously, I've also included Harley and Superman here. You're not going to be able to use Superman immediately, but depending on when you start on a fresh server, you will have access to obtain Superman, and you'll be able to insert him into your lineup. Now, Superman is not the best character at this mode. He's still going to be used fairly heavily. If you have him at white stars, he is 100% worth including in your lineup. Stick him up front. He's going to help tank a little bit of that damage and keep the heat off of your ranged DPS and your healers. So he's certainly worth using in this fight, even though he does single target damage. I've included Harley here because I think she's really the quintessential free-to-play mythic, and I think she does fairly well in this mode because she can do a decent amount of AoE, and if you have the right amount of stars on her, she will have a decent amount of self-sustain from her kit. She'll be able to heal herself. So I think this is a great lineup of free-to-play characters, and I will show you what they look like against the Merciless in a moment. For light spenders, I've included a few characters here that are bleed limited, such as Joker. And the reasoning behind that is Joker is actually fairly viable at low stars for fights like this because he's able to put a decent amount of dots up on all the enemies, and he'll be able to do a decent amount of damage. I didn't include many of the Arkham characters in the light spin category. Obviously, if you have, for example, Penguin or maybe even Two-Face, you could try to use them here with Joker and Ivy to try to get a little bit of synergy. I do think that would probably buff up your Joker just a little bit. But I've also included Batman here. I think Batman is a really solid character for this specific boss because he has some pretty good AoE. You really want to try to use Batman with a full Justice League team. So obviously Green Lantern isn't exactly free-to-play friendly at all. So I think that maybe limits him just a bit. But again, he's still a very solid character for this game mode because just like Superman, be able to put out a decent amount of damage. You can put him up front. He's going to take a brunt of the beating from all of those waves of mobs. And then, of course, I've included Green Arrow and Mira here because they continue to do well all the way up the chain to the whale category. And for whales, I've included a decent amount of the bleed limited characters here. Constantine is ridiculous in this game mode whenever people have access to him. He's going to do really well. I think Deathstroke and Sinestro are worth mentioning. Legion of Doom, Arkham mixed lineups, I think will do really well against this boss. And then, of course, you have the full range of healers and supports to choose from here. I've included a few that I think are worth using against this boss. And that's really it. So let's jump over and we can take a look at a couple of runs against the Merciless. The first run is going to be a free-to-play run. So we will do Wonder Woman up front along with Harley Quinn, and then we'll throw Green Arrow in the back with Red Hood and Mira. And let's see how this comp goes. You do get a Weapon Master buff here, which is pretty nice. So you can see mobs are being summoned on the left and right, and we've got a warrior and a guardian up front who are kind of soaking up a decent amount of that damage. And there's our first Fires of Hades. Early on in this fight, there's not a ton of damage going out against your team, but it really does ramp up. The more waves that you kill, the more damage Merciless is going to do, and also the more damage that those additional waves are going to do. And they also become quite tanky towards the end. We do still have our Red Hood at the 1 minute mark. That's pretty average. He's going to start taking a pretty considerable amount of damage here in just a second. You see he's going down pretty quickly. But, you know, Mira is quite effective with healing. And Red Hood dies with 10 seconds left. That's so sad. It's not bad at all. So we reached, with that fight, 127 of the milestones. Obviously, your personal damage is going to vary because this is an account that's been around for quite a while. But you can see what kind of damage these characters are able to do. And you wouldn't think it against a bunch of waves of mobs, but Green Arrow is able to hold his own fairly well and do a considerable amount of damage here. And the second fight is going to be more of a whale or long-term player, min-maxer, but we're going to throw in Superman, Ivy, Constantine, Zatanna, and Batman. So you'll see that these vines are being summoned and some of these mobs are going to attack those vines. It does peel a little bit of the damage off of your tanks or your guardians, warriors, which is very nice. I like to use Ivy for that reason. Constantine is just really, really good, especially when you pair him with Zatanna. And that's actually a point that's worth making here, is that I think Constantine is clearly a very high-end S-tier character, but he tends to be even better when he has Zatanna around. I've ran a few test rounds with and without Zatanna, with Constantine in the lineup, and he tends to do considerably more damage. And I think you're also going to get a little bit more damage out of your Superman. You see we did lose Batman there with a few seconds left, but we're doubling our score from the free-to-play version by having a couple of these additional characters in the lineup. And you can see there Constantine doing considerable amounts of damage, and Zatanna actually did more damage than our Batman did. I think a couple of traps to mention. Guardian characters aren't that useful here. They're not going to do a ton of damage. They're certainly helpful for players who don't have access to a lot of characters in their roster. Certainly, you can see that Wonder Woman was able to keep the rest of the team alive, I think, for the free-to-play fight that we did. But just know you're going to get a little bit more damage output out of using some of your warriors. And then the other thing is, I do think that most players should avoid Aquaman unless you have a very heavily developed Justice League roster that you can throw him into. It's worth mentioning again here that Ivy's ability to soak aggro and ability to put out a decent amount of healing through her vines is fairly valuable for this fight. And as always, manual control can be your friend in combat cycle fights where you're dealing with massive AoEs that come in. Sometimes sometimes the AI will target the wrong places for healing. And I think I see this especially with Mira. That's going to do it for this Merciless video. If it wasn't painfully obvious already, Merciless is the combat cycle boss where you can obtain AC/DC shards. And so I think this is a very important boss for you to master, and so that you can max out those rewards as quickly as you can. And speaking of Force, if you haven't already checked it out, I did a recent video on Force and how to invest AC/DC shards in the right characters to make sure that your roster is progressing smoothly. As with my other combat cycle guides, there will be a companion accordion infographic that will be available in all the places that you can find me on social media. If you found this video helpful, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel for future DC Dark Legion content, and I'll see you in the next video.